The sky was soft that evening, like a faded quilt stretched over the horizon. Light from the setting sun spilled across the porch, warm and golden, turning everything it touched into memory. The old oak tree in the front yard cast long shadows on the dusty gravel driveway. The cicadas had just begun their evening hum, rising in a slow rhythm that matched the quiet creak of the porch swing. Harold sat alone on that swing, as he did most nights. It wasn't that he minded the solitude. After all these years, it had a kind of peace to it. But the silence had changed since Margaret passed. It used to be filled with her voice, her laughter, the way she'd hum old songs while folding the laundry or tell him what the neighbors were up to, even if he didn't really care. Now the silence had an edge to it, not sharp but empty. His hand rested on the arm of the swing, fingers curled gently as if waiting for hers to find them. The swing creaked again, back and forth, back and forth. It was old, but it held. Just like him. He looked out over the yard, watching the slow flicker of lightning bugs begin to the bushes. A breeze picked up and carried the scent of jasmine, mixed with freshly cut grass. Somewhere down the road, a screen door banged shut, followed by the faint sound of a dog barking. The world, it seemed, hadn't forgotten how to move forward, even if Harold sometimes had. He reached beside him to the small table and picked up his glass of sweet tea. Margaret had always made it too sweet, but he'd grown used to it. He still made it the same way, out of habit, or maybe as a small way to keep her close. He took a sip and let it sit on his tongue a moment before swallowing. His eyes drifted to the swing chains above him. The wood had faded over the years, worn smooth where their hands had touched it most. He remembered building it, the way she'd watched him from the porch steps, her straw hat tilted just so, a glass of lemonade in her hand. "Make it strong," she'd said, smiling. "We're going to be old on that swing one day." They had been. Even now, he sometimes forgot she was gone. Just this morning, he'd caught himself setting out 2 cups of tea. Habit was a strange thing. It clung to the edges of life long after reason had stepped aside. A robin chirped in the branches overhead. The wind chimes, those brass ones Margaret loved, began to sing their quiet tune. Harold closed his eyes for a moment, just long enough to feel the wind brush against his cheek. "You always liked evenings best," he murmured. There was no reply, of course, but he could almost hear her voice in the rustle of leaves. They'd spent hundreds of evenings on this very swing, talking, not talking, listening to the world, watching their children grow, and later, watching the quiet after they'd all gone. The swing had been there through it all, birthdays, goodbyes, anniversaries, even a few arguments, but mostly peace. Harold opened his eyes again, blinking slowly as the porch light flickered on behind him, triggered by the dusk. He leaned back into the swing, letting it take his weight. It was creaky. It groaned, but it held. Like memory, like love. He pulled the old Afghan over his lap, the one Margaret had knitted the winter after she retired. It was too warm for it, but it gave him something to hold on to. He looked down at the worn patterns, tiny flowers stitched in fading yarn, and smiled. Margaret had never rushed anything. Not her knitting, not her cooking, not even her goodbyes, especially not her goodbyes. Harold wasn't sure when he started talking to her out loud. Maybe it had started one of those first nights after the funeral. Or maybe it was when the neighbors stopped calling, when the quiet became too heavy not to share. "I saw Tommy's boy today," he said softly. "He's taller now. Got your eyes, I think." A pause, then a chuckle. "Though maybe that's just me seeing what I want." He took another sip of tea. The ice had mostly melted. "I planted new daisies by the mailbox. They're holding up better than last year's batch." The swing moved slightly with the wind. The night deepened. Fireflies floated in the distance, like tiny stars that had come down for a visit. A cat padded across the edge of the porch and disappeared into the shadows. Harold looked up at the sky. "You ever wonder if you're up there somewhere?" he asked. "I do. Most nights." The stars blinked silently in return. "I don't need a big sign," he added. "Just something small, like a breeze or a creak." The swing rocked gently. He smiled, not because he believed in ghosts, but because somehow it didn't matter. Believing wasn't the point. Remembering was. He glanced at the empty space beside him and gave it a gentle pat. "I'm still here," he whispered. Then he closed his eyes, letting the creak of the swing, the hum of the cicadas, and the distant wind lull him into rest. Not sleep exactly, just a resting of the heart. Before the swing, there was just the porch. Back then, it was bare wood and empty space, a rectangle of potential looking out over a yard that still had more weeds and flowers. The house itself had needed work, plenty of it, but Harold and Margaret hadn't minded. They were young, the kind of young that believes time will always wait. Harold had bought the place the year after their wedding. It had been cheap and leaning slightly to the left, but it had good bones, as Margaret's father said. More importantly, it had a porch, a wide one that faced the west, perfect for sunsets and dreaming. And Harold, quietly, had dreamed of a swing. The first summer in the house was hot and filled with work. Margaret had insisted on planting marigolds along the fence. Harold had dug out rocks from the soil and discovered a patch of old broken glass where the garden would go. There were no air conditioners then, just open windows, cold cloths on the back of the neck, and gallons of sweet tea. They made tea every afternoon, Margaret's recipe, which Harold always said was too sweet, and which she always ignored. "You'll thank me when the sun starts melting your boots," she'd say, handing him a glass so full of ice it clinked like wind chimes. He did thank her, nearly every day. They had no money for fancy things, but Margaret had a gift for turning the ordinary into comfort. Old sheets became curtains. A chipped teacup became a vase. And every evening, no matter how hot or how tired they were, they sat on that porch with their tea, watching the sun drift down behind the oak trees and the distant hills. Back then, there was no swing. Just two mismatched wooden chairs with peeling paint and a crate between them. But they talked about it often. "One day," Margaret said, "when we have the time and the money and your knees stop complaining, you'll build us a swing." Harold would nod. "I will. I've got the plans in my head." "They better be good plans," she teased, sipping her tea. "This porch deserves something romantic." He smiled. "Are you saying I'm not romantic?" "I'm saying the porch is waiting." So he waited too. He waited through hot summers and long winters, through fixing pipes and repainting the kitchen and patching the roof twice. They raised their kids in that house, Tommy and Ruth, and the porch became their little family stage. It was where Ruth practiced her spelling words, where Tommy read comic books and tried to launch paper planes into the neighbor's yard. But Harold never forgot the swing. And one spring, just after Tommy left for college and the house felt a little too big, Harold decided it was time. He spent a week in the shed behind the house, measuring, sawing, sanding. Margaret brought him lemonade and shook her head whenever he cursed under his breath. "You could just buy one," she said one evening, wiping sawdust from his cheek. "I could," he said, "but then it wouldn't be ours." When it was done, they carried it to the porch together, Harold at one end, Margaret at the other. They hung it from thick chains under the beam Harold had reinforced just for that purpose. It creaked the first time they sat on it, but it held. Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "Now the porch is perfect." Harold had never been prouder. From then on, the swing became part of their life, part of the rhythm of each day. They sat in it through birthdays and anniversaries, through arguments and reconciliations, through long silences and bursts of laughter. One afternoon, when the kids were visiting and the yard was full of noise again, Harold caught Margaret watching the swing from the kitchen window. "Thinking of something?" he asked. She smiled, just remembering how empty the porch used to feel. Funny how a swing can make things feel whole. That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, they sat out there again, the swing gently rocking, the stars shining through a thin curtain of clouds. Margaret held his hand and said, "When I'm old and gray, I want to die right here, on this swing, with your hand in mine." Harold had chuckled nervously. "You'll outlive me. You're too stubborn to die." "Maybe," she'd said, resting her head against him. "But if I go first, don't let the swing go to waste. Promise me." "I promise." He kept that promise. Even now, years later, with her gone and the house much quieter than he liked, Harold found comfort in those memories. The swing wasn't just wood and chain. It was every conversation, every moment they'd lived through. It was proof of time well spent. He still made sweet tea every afternoon. Too sweet, just the way she liked it. And every evening, he poured 2 glasses, one for himself and one for the space beside him. The porch had once been empty, a space waiting to be filled. Now it was full of memory, of warmth, and of a quiet kind of love that didn't need words anymore. As the sun dipped low and the sky turned lavender, Harold rocked gently back and forth, the tea sweating in its glass, the wind brushing his cheek like a hand from another life. He closed his eyes and smiled. The porch was never really empty. Not anymore. The clouds rolled in just after lunch. They weren't the soft, passing kind that brushed the sky like feathers. These were thick, slate-colored giants, gathering along the horizon with the kind of weight that made even the birds go silent. Harold noticed them first, standing at the back fence, trowel in hand, dirt clinging to his knees. "Looks like we're in for a show," he muttered, glancing toward the west. Inside, Margaret was folding laundry, humming to herself. She didn't hear the first distant rumble of thunder, but she felt the change in the air. The breeze that had been warm and lazy all morning turned sudden and cool, brushing against her arms like a warning. By the time Harold came in, the wind had started to lift the corners of the curtains. "Storm's coming," he said, brushing off his boots at the door. Margaret nodded and looked out the window. "You think we'll lose power?" Harold shrugged. "Maybe. First real one this season." She handed him a towel. "Well, you better light the lamps and find the candles. I'm not sitting in the dark with just your stories to keep me company." He grinned. "My stories are the best part of any blackout." She raised an eyebrow. Debatable. They moved through the little house together, checking windows, pulling down the laundry from the line, setting out a flashlight and an old battery-powered radio. It wasn't fear that guided their actions, but a kind of practiced readiness. Storms were part of life out here, and part of love too, in their own way. When the first drops began to fall, they hit the roof like soft pebbles. Margaret lit a lamp in the kitchen, the flame flickering as if unsure it wanted to stay. Harold stood at the screen door and watched the sky darken. "I like the smell of rain before it really starts," Margaret said, coming up beside him. "Like something waking up." "It's the smell of wet dust," he replied. She wrinkled her nose. "Don't ruin it." The storm broke not long after. Rain came in sheets, sweeping across the yard and turning the flower beds into puddles. The wind pressed against the house, moaning through the trees, rattling the gutters. The porch swing rocked slowly on its chains, empty for once. The power blinked out with a loud click, followed by silence. Then laughter. Margaret held the lamp up, casting warm light between them. "Well, it's just you, me, and the storm now." Harold reached for her hand. "Guess we better make it cozy." They wrapped themselves in an old quilt and sat on the floor by the window, watching lightning split the sky in jagged silver lines. The thunder shook the window panes, but it wasn't frightening. Not together. It was like the sky itself had something to say, something loud and urgent and honest. "I used to be afraid of storms when I was little," Margaret said softly. "I thought they meant God was angry." Harold glanced at her. "And now I think they're just reminders that we're small and lucky." He let that settle between them for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't need filling. Then he said, "You ever think about how fragile everything is?" She smiled without looking at him. "All the time." Outside, the swing moved again, this time harder, jerking with the wind. Rain splashed onto the porch in wide, diagonal strokes. A crack of thunder rolled so loudly through the walls that Margaret jumped. Harold put an arm around her shoulders. "We built this house good," he said. "It'll hold." "I know," she whispered. "It's not the house I worry about." He kissed the top of her head. "We'll hold, too." They sat there for a long time, two figures wrapped in a quilt, surrounded by candlelight and the pounding rhythm of a summer storm. And slowly, as storms do, it began to soften. The rain lightened, the thunder grew distant, and the wind exhaled its last breath. Margaret stood first, stretching her arms above her head. "I vote tea," she declared. "We've earned it." No power, Harold reminded. But gas stove still works. You boil the water, I'll find the lemon. They moved easily through the darkness, guided by memory more than light. The kitchen smelled like warm wood and old stories. The kettle began to whistle. The teacups, Margaret's favorites with the faded blue roses, sat waiting. They carried their tea out to the porch, where the swing, damp but steady, invited them back. We'll dry, Margaret said, sinking down beside him. The cushion squelched slightly. Harold laughed. You're a romantic and a fool. Takes one to marry one. They sipped their tea in the hush that followed the storm. The only sound the drip, drip, drip of water from the roof and the distant croak of frogs waking in the soaked grass. That was our first real storm here, Margaret said, leaning against him. Harold nodded. We did all right. We did more than all right. She was right. Storms come and go. They rattle walls and stir up dust. But some things, the ones built carefully, tended lovingly, they hold. Like houses, like porch swings, like love. Harold had never been much for birthdays. As a boy, they'd come and gone without much fuss. Maybe a slice of cake, a pat on the back from his father, and once, a slingshot wrapped in newspaper that broke the same day. Birthdays, to him, had always been just another day, with chores to do and boots to clean. That changed with Margaret. She loved birthdays, not just her own, but everyone's. She remembered dates with a precision that rivaled calendars. She sent cards weeks in advance, tied them with ribbons, and always wrote a note in her looping cursive that said something small but unforgettable. Birthdays aren't about getting old, she told Harold once. They're about remembering that we're still here. He hadn't known what to say to that, so he kissed her instead. Their first birthday together as a married couple was simple. Margaret baked a chocolate cake, slightly lopsided, with frosting that melted in the summer heat, and surprised Harold with it when he came in from fixing the fence. He had dirt on his elbows and a sunburn across his nose. She wore a blue dress and a smile that made him forget how tired he was. He stared at the cake, then at her. You remembered, he said. She laughed. Of course I remembered. You married a woman with a steel trap mind. He hadn't expected anything. Certainly not candles. But there they were, 30 of them, one for every year he'd walked this earth, dancing in the breeze on their little kitchen table. She insisted he make a wish. He did. He wished that every birthday could be like this. Just her, the kitchen, and the warmth between them. He didn't tell her that part. In return, Harold always tried to make Margaret's birthday special. But Margaret didn't like expensive things. She didn't wear much jewelry. She didn't want to go out to restaurants. Her favorite gifts were always the ones Harold made himself. A wooden jewelry box one year, a pressed flower bookmark the next. One year, when they were particularly tight on money, he carved her name into the side of the porch swing, just below the armrest where her hand always rested. It was small, almost hidden beneath the grain, but she found it that same evening. She traced the letters with her fingertip and said softly, "Better than a diamond." Over the years, the birthdays piled up like soft blankets, one atop another, each a little worn but full of comfort. Some were loud, when the kids were young, the house bursting with balloons and icing on noses. Others were quiet, just the two of them, tea on the porch, a card tucked under a napkin. Harold always remembered, even if he pretended not to. It was their little ritual. He'd act like the date had slipped his mind, grumble over his coffee, pretend to forget to pick up the mail, and Margaret would play along, sighing dramatically, shaking her head, muttering about old husbands with old memories. But by lunchtime, there'd always be a surprise. Once it was a daisy tucked behind her ear. Once it was her favorite poem rewritten in Harold's awkward handwriting. Once, when she turned 60, he brought home a stray kitten she'd seen at the market. They named him Biscuit. "You know what I want next year?" she said once, curled up beside him on the swing. "What's that?" "A birthday where we don't do anything at all. Just sit here, all day." He nodded. "That I can manage." And they did. On her 73rd birthday, Margaret didn't want cake, didn't want cards or songs or fuss. She just wanted time. So they spent the whole day on the porch, from morning sun to evening stars, talking when they felt like it, sitting in silence when they didn't. The swing moved slow and steady. The wind came and went, and time, for once, didn't feel like it was rushing past. It was her last birthday. Harold didn't know that, of course. Neither did she. But when he looked back later, it felt like something inside them must have known. After Margaret passed, birthdays became quiet again. Not because Harold forgot, but because remembering hurt in a different way. He still marked the dates. On her birthday each year, he would brew 2 cups of tea, place one on her side of the swing, and sit with her name under his hand. He didn't cry, not always, but he remembered her laugh, the way her eyes sparkled when she opened a handmade card, the sound of her blowing out candles with that little whistle she never could hide. One year, Ruth sent him a card with a photo of Margaret in her garden, white hat, dirt on her knees, a grin as wide as the sky. Inside, she wrote, "Still blooming, Dad, just in a different place." Harold kept that card in the drawer by his bed. This year, on her birthday, he added something new. He planted a rose bush near the porch, right where the afternoon sun hit best. Margaret had always wanted one, but they'd never quite gotten around to it. The soil was stubborn, and Harold's knees were worse than before, but he took his time, dug deep, patted the dirt smooth. Then he sat on the swing, drank his tea, and watched the sun melt into the earth. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," he whispered, and for just a moment, the wind smelled like marigolds and sweet cake. It started with a cough, not a deep one, not the kind that echoed or demanded attention, just a small sound, soft and dry, like dust shifting in an old attic. Margaret brushed it off at first. "Too much dust in that pantry," she said, waving her hand. "I've told you for years we need to reorganize it." Harold had chuckled, as always. "I'll get to it right after I repaint the barn and learn French." But the cough didn't go away. A week passed, then 2. Then came the fatigue. Margaret, who once couldn't sit still for more than 10 minutes, began resting more often, not just on the swing, but in bed, her hands folded quietly over her stomach, her eyes closed even when she was awake. Harold noticed, of course. He noticed the teacups left untouched, the garden left unweeded, the way she winced slightly when she stood. He offered help, but she shook her head, always with that same smile. "I'm fine," she insisted. "Just getting older. Happens to the best of us." But something in her voice had changed. So they went to the doctor, then to a specialist, then to another. The words came slowly, like clouds building before a storm. Chronic, progressive, nothing we can do but manage. Harold listened without blinking, his hands clasped together, knuckles white. Margaret sat beside him, calm as ever, nodding at each explanation like she already knew. Maybe she did. On the drive home, they didn't speak. The road stretched ahead, lined with fading fields and fence posts. The silence wasn't heavy, just full. Full of thoughts not yet ready to become words. That evening, they sat on the porch swing like they always did. But this time, Margaret brought a blanket. "Cold?" Harold asked gently. She shook her head. "No, just comforting." They didn't talk much that night. The swing creaked beneath them. The wind moved through the trees, like a slow breath. Somewhere far off, a barn owl called into the dusk. Harold reached for her hand. She let him hold it. Weeks passed, and the illness moved in like a quiet tenant, changing small things first. Margaret stopped cooking. Then she stopped going outside in the mornings. Then, one day, she didn't come out to the porch at all. Harold waited that evening with 2 cups of tea. He sat on the swing, her cup placed carefully beside him, untouched. The space where she always sat felt impossibly large. He didn't cry. He just rocked, back and forth, back and forth. The swing creaked, the same creak it had made for decades. But without her weight beside him, it sounded different, too loud, too hollow. Inside, he could hear the low hum of her breathing machine, the nurse's soft footsteps, the rustle of a blanket being adjusted. He hated it, not the care, not the people, just the fact that she needed it at all. The porch had always been their world. Now it felt like a doorway to something else, something closing. Each night, Harold brought out the tea. Sometimes she joined him for a minute or two, wrapped in quilts, too tired to speak. Other nights, it was just him, but the swing never stopped moving. One night, as autumn crept into the air, Harold sat alone again. The wind had grown colder. The stars were sharp against the sky. He held her cup in his hands, letting the warmth soak into his fingers. He didn't speak. There was no one to listen, but in his chest, thoughts moved like slow rivers. He remembered their first winter together, the time the pipes froze, and they had to heat water on the stove. He remembered the way she laughed in the candlelight, face flushed with cold and joy. He remembered everything, and in that remembering, something softened. The swing moved gently, like breath. The wind carried the faintest trace of lavender, or lotion, the one she'd used for years. Harold looked at the empty space beside him. "You don't have to fight so hard," he said softly. "If you're tired, it's all right." The wind didn't answer, but the stars seemed to blink a little slower, and for the first time, Harold felt something close to acceptance. He finished his tea and sat for a while longer, letting the quiet be what it needed to be. The drawer had always stuck a little. Harold knew the trick. Pull left, lift slightly, then ease it forward. Margaret used to call it the secret handshake of the old oak dresser. She'd kept the drawer neat for decades. Handkerchiefs folded by color, a small tin of buttons, a tiny glass bottle filled with lavender seeds, and under all that, the letters. Harold didn't find them until months after the house grew quiet. It was a chilly afternoon in late November, the kind of day where the cold came not from wind, but from stillness. Outside, the porch swing swayed in an empty breeze, and inside, Harold had decided to clean, not because it needed doing, but because it gave his hand something to do. He moved slowly through the bedroom, dusting frames, straightening books, opening drawers he hadn't touched in years. When he got to the old dresser, he hesitated. The scent of lavender drifted up before he even touched it. Faint but there. He smiled. "Still here," he whispered. He opened the drawer. The top layer was just as he remembered. Handkerchiefs in soft white cotton, yellowing a bit at the edges. He lifted them gently, folding them again out of habit. The button tin jingled softly, and then, beneath the lavender bottle, he saw it. A bundle of envelopes, tied with twine. Not dusty, not old, recent. The top envelope had his name on it. Harold. Just that. He stared at it for a long while before picking it up. The handwriting was Margaret's. Unmistakable. Neat, curling slightly, a bit shakier than it used to be. His fingers trembled slightly as he untied the twine. Inside the envelope was a letter, 3 pages, written front and back. He read it twice. Then he read it a third time. "Dear Harold, if you're reading this, it means you finally opened that stubborn drawer. Or maybe the house nudged you toward it. Either way, I'm glad. I didn't want to say too much while I was sick. I know how you are. You'd carry my sadness on your shoulders if I let you. But I've had time, these quiet afternoons, to think, to feel, to write. So I did. There are a few more letters in this drawer. One for each of the moments I imagined you might need me. You don't have to read them all at once. Just when you're ready. I trust you'll know when. This one is just to say thank you. For the swing. For the tea. For never rushing me, even when the world did. For always reaching for my hand first. For the roses you planted and the jokes you told, even the terrible ones. For making a life with me that felt, every day, like home. I hope you still sit on the porch. I hope you still make the tea too sweet. And I hope you know, even when you sit alone, I'm not far. Love always. Margaret. Harold folded the letter slowly, as if afraid it might vanish. He held it to his chest, then to his lips. His eyes blurred, but he didn't brush the tears away. He let them fall, quiet as rain. For a long while, he didn't move. The afternoon light shifted across the floor. The house, though still, did not feel empty. When he finally looked into the drawer again, he saw the rest of the letters. Each envelope had a simple word on the front. For when you're lonely. For when you miss me most. For the first winter without me. For when you don't feel strong. For your last birthday. There were 6 in total. Harold didn't open any more that day. He didn't need to. Just knowing they were there, that she'd thought ahead, that she'd written them with care and time, filled something in him. that had been slowly hollowing out. He placed the bundle back into the drawer, tied with the same twine, and closed it carefully. Then he stood, walked to the kitchen, and made a fresh pot of tea, sweeter than usual. As the kettle hissed, he glanced toward the porch. Outside, the swing rocked gently. He poured 2 cups. The space beside him was still empty, but not alone. The knock came on a Tuesday. 3 short raps on the screen door, followed by the unmistakable sound of sneakers scuffing the porch boards. Harold was in the kitchen, pouring his second cup of tea, the sweeter one, always poured for the other cup that sat untouched. He didn't move right away. No one knocked much these days. The mailman didn't bother, just dropped things in the box and waved. The neighbors were polite, but quiet. Most visitors had faded away after the funeral, their casseroles and polite condolences evaporating like fog in the morning sun. But this knock was different. He opened the door, and there she was. "Hi, Grandpa," said a voice as familiar as spring. Ellie. She stood on the porch in a windbreaker 3 sizes too big, a backpack slung over one shoulder, a lopsided smile on her face. Her hair had gotten longer. Harold hadn't seen her since the summer before Margaret passed. College, he remembered. Out west somewhere. Something with computers. He blinked. "Ellie," she shrugged. Surprise. Harold opened the door wider without a word, and she stepped into the house like she had 100 times before. They sat on the porch swing not long after. It creaked under the New Balance, lighter on one side than Harold was used to. Ellie pulled her knees up under her and sipped the too sweet tea he'd poured her without thinking. "Wow," she said, wincing slightly. "Grandma's recipe." He nodded. "Some things don't change." "I can tell." The swing rocked gently. The sky was overcast, but warm. Somewhere nearby, a cardinal chirped like it had news to tell. They talked, not about grief, not right away. They talked about school, and a road trip Ellie had taken with friends. About her attempts at cooking, disasters, every time, and how she still couldn't keep a plant alive for more than a week. Harold listened, chuckled, offered the occasional grunt of approval. And then, after a lull, Ellie said, "I miss her." The words fell into the quiet, like a single drop of rain on dry soil. Harold swallowed. "Me too." They didn't speak again for a while. They didn't need to. Then Ellie reached into her backpack and pulled out a small, worn book, one of Margaret's old gardening journals. "I found this in a box when Mom was cleaning out the garage," she said. "It has her handwriting, notes, sketches of flowers, and letters." Harold raised his eyebrows. "Letters." "She wrote little things in the margins, like diary entries, and she wrote about you. A lot." Ellie flipped it open and held it out. Harold took it, his hands a little unsteady. The handwriting danced across the yellowed pages, still neat, still her. Notes about tomatoes, about when to prune the rosebushes, and then, in the corner of a page about soil acidity, a line in blue ink. "Harold fixed the back gate today. Didn't ask, just did it. I love the way he takes care of things." Harold smiled. He turned the page. We sat on the swing until the stars came out. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. His eyes blurred, and this time, he didn't mind. "She wrote about the swing a lot," Ellie said. "It was like her diary was written on this porch." Harold nodded slowly. It was. That evening, after supper, they sat out again, this time with a blanket over their knees, just like Margaret used to do. The stars came out slowly, one by one. Ellie pointed at constellations and got half of them wrong, but Harold didn't correct her. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You ever feel like she's still here?" she asked. "All the time," he said. Ellie was quiet for a moment. "Do you think she'd be proud of me?" Harold turned to look at her, this grown-up version of the little girl who once chased butterflies in the garden and ate cookies before dinner. "She always was," he said, and in the stillness of the porch, in the creak of the swing, in the stars overhead and the warmth between them, Harold felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that grows slowly, like marigolds in rocky soil. That night, after Ellie had gone to bed, Harold sat out a little longer. He didn't bring 2 cups of tea this time, just one. but he held Margaret's gardening journal in his lap, and under the porch light, he began to read, page by page, memory by memory, love still blooming. It rarely snowed that far south. Maybe once every few years, the clouds would get brave enough, the wind would get cold enough, and the world would wake up wearing white. Harold remembered the last time it had snowed, really snowed. He and Margaret had stood at the window like children, watching the flakes drift down in lazy circles. The porch was blanketed in silence. Even the swing seemed too stunned to move. "I always wanted a snow day," she said, tugging her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. "You're 72, Harold replied, and retired. "Doesn't mean I can't wish for one." So they made one. They stayed in their pajamas all day, made oatmeal with too much cinnamon, drank tea in mugs too large for their hands, and in the afternoon, bundled in coats and scarves, they walked out into the yard like explorers on a new planet. Margaret tossed a handful of snow at him. Harold retaliated with a badly aimed snowball that landed on the porch steps. She laughed until she coughed, then smiled, brushing snow from her lashes. "Perfect," she said. He hadn't known it then, but it would be the last snowfall she'd ever see. Now, years later, the sky once again turned the color of smoke. Ellie was the one who noticed it first. "Grandpa," she called from the kitchen, "is it snowing?" Harold walked to the window. Sure enough, tiny flakes danced in the air, landing gently on the railing, on the top of the porch swing, on the hat rack by the door. He felt something move in his chest, not quite pain, not quite joy, just memory, rising like breath in cold air. "You want to go outside?" Ellie asked. He hesitated, then nodded. "I suppose it's a snow day." They bundled up, Harold in his heavy coat that smelled of cedar, Ellie in 2 layers of socks, and the same too big windbreaker. She tugged a knit hat over her ears and grinned at him like she was 5 again. The yard was quiet. The snow hadn't stuck yet, but it was trying. The air smelled clean. The sky was soft, like someone had laid a blanket over the world. Ellie reached down and scooped a palmful of snow. "Still fluffy," she said. Harold raised an eyebrow. "Don't even think about it." But she did. The snowball hit his shoulder, light as a tap. He bent down slowly. His knees didn't care for surprises anymore. He formed one of his own. "Revenge," he muttered, and tossed it. It missed by 2 feet. They both laughed. The sound echoed across the yard like something sacred had just been returned. After a while, they retreated to the porch. Ellie brushed snow from the swing's cushion before sitting. "I see what Grandma loved about this spot," she said, "even when it's cold." Harold sat beside her, exhaling into the crisp air. "It sees everything, but it keeps its secrets." She smiled. "Like you." He didn't answer, just rocked gently. They watched the snow fall in silence. It coated the bushes, the rosebush Margaret had wanted. It frosted the edges of the porch railing. Even the garden stones looked softer somehow. Ellie reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote something," she said. "For Grandma. Sort of. I don't know if it's a letter or a poem. I just wanted to tell her I'm okay. That you're okay. That we're still here." Harold didn't look at her, but his hand reached over and squeezed hers. "You want to read it aloud?" he asked. She nodded, and she did. Her voice was soft, unsteady in places, but steady where it mattered. The poem wasn't fancy. It didn't rhyme, but it was true. When she finished, Harold looked out at the snow-covered swing set in the yard, long abandoned, half buried in white. "She would have loved that," he said. Ellie leaned her head on his shoulder again. She would have loved today. And she had. Somewhere, Harold could feel it. Not in a ghostly way, but in the warmth of the memory. The way the porch didn't feel empty. The way snow made everything quieter, but not lonelier. That night, long after the snow had stopped and the world was tucked under its white blanket, Harold sat alone for a while. The swing moved with him, slowly. He looked out over the yard, and for the first time in a long time, he whispered not goodbye, but thank you. The drawer opened more easily this time. Maybe the wood had settled. Maybe Harold's hands no longer hesitated. Or maybe, after all this time, the drawer simply knew it was time. The bundle of letters was thinner now, 5 of them already read. so more than once, their creases softened from trembling hands and quiet tears. Only one remained. It was the smallest envelope of all, the one Margaret had labeled, "When you don't feel strong." Harold stared at the words for a long while. The ink had faded a little, but the curves of her handwriting still danced with the same quiet grace. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he carried it to the porch. The morning was gray. A gentle mist clung to the edges of the yard. The roses Margaret loved were sleeping beneath winter's hush, and the swing, familiar as ever, waited for him like it always had. Harold sat slowly, holding the envelope in both hands. He had woken up that morning with a heaviness in his chest. Not pain, not the sharp kind. Just weight, the weight of years, of memories, of mornings that came too quickly and nights that stayed too long. He had tried to shake it with tea, with toast, with a glance at Ellie's cheerful note on the fridge, but the ache remained. So now, in the hush of morning, with breath rising in small clouds, he opened the letter. "My Harold, if your hands are holding this letter, then it must be one of those days. The kind where the bed feels too big, the silence too loud, the tea too bitter, or maybe just too quiet, without my spoon tapping the side of the cup. And that's okay. You've always been the strong one, even when you didn't think you were. You held everything together, the roof, the garden, the swing me. But even strong hearts get tired, love. So here's what I want you to do today. Don't pretend. Don't tidy up the grief. Don't brush it off like dust on the porch rail. Let it sit with you. Let the ache breathe. And then, after a while, go make the tea. 2 cups, if you'd like. One for you, and one for the memory. Read something. A poem, maybe. Or one of those ridiculous gardening magazines we used to laugh at. Walk in the yard, even if it's muddy. Talk to the roses. Tell them I said hello. And when the weight returns tomorrow, because it will, remember this. You don't have to carry me. I'm already with you. In the swing, in the kettle, in the corner of your smile, when you remember the way I used to sing off key. You don't have to be strong every day, Harold. You just have to stay. And I'll be here. Love you always. Even in the quiet. Margaret." Harold didn't cry right away. He read the letter again, slower this time, letting each word land, like raindrops in dry soil. Then he folded it carefully, pressed it to his lips, and placed it beside him on the swing. The air was still, but not empty. A cardinal landed on the porch rail, red against gray, bold, as if it had something to say. It looked at Harold, head tilted. He smiled. "I'm still here," he whispered, and somehow he knew. So was she. Spring came slowly that year. It didn't arrive with fanfare, no dramatic bloom, no warm wind sweeping away winter in a single breath. Instead, it crept in gently, like someone easing open a door to avoid waking the house. One morning, the roses stirred. Another, the grass turned a little greener. And on the 3rd day of April, Harold stepped onto the porch and didn't need a coat. He stood there a long while, hands in his pockets, watching sunlight catch on the rim of Margaret's rosebush. It had bloomed again, not fully, not proudly, but just enough to say, "I'm still trying." Ellie joined him a little later. She was staying for the week. Spring break from her 2nd semester, hair a little shorter now, her face a little older. "I had an idea," she said, sipping tea that wasn't quite as sweet as Grandma used to make. "You don't have to say yes, but I think Grandma would like it." Harold raised an eyebrow. "Go on." She hesitated, then pulled out a sketch. Charcoal on paper, rough but full of care. A bench, under a tree, just past the rosebush, facing the fields beyond. She always said the view from there was her favorite, Ellie explained. "And I thought maybe, if we built something, a place people could sit, remember her, or just rest a while." Harold looked at the drawing. He saw more than lines and shapes. He saw Margaret in her sun hat, humming quietly. He saw 2 cups of tea, steaming on the armrest. He saw children, maybe great-grandchildren someday, climbing nearby, laughter floating like dandelion fluff. He nodded once. "Let's build it." They worked together the next morning. Harold brought out the old tools, rusted at the edges, but still faithful. Ellie measured, held planks steady, fetched nails. Birds watched from the wires above, as if supervising the project with quiet approval. By afternoon, the bench stood solid and true beneath the tall oak tree. They didn't paint it. Margaret wouldn't have wanted that. Instead, they carved a small inscription into the backrest. Simple, just a few words. Still here. M. They didn't need to explain it. If you knew, you knew. That evening, they sat on the bench together. The sun slid behind the hills, like it always did. The sky blushed pink. Crickets warmed up their nightly song. I think she would have liked this, Ellie said, brushing sawdust from her jeans. Harold didn't speak right away. He was looking out over the field, eyes distant, but not lost. Then quietly he said, I don't think she ever left. Ellie reached for his hand. The swing on the porch still moved with the wind. The bench beneath them held their weight, and in the hush between day and night, Harold realized something. Grief was not the end of love. It was just love's shadow, long and sometimes heavy, but proof that something real had stood in the light, and always would.